My apologies. Yes, okay, well, sorry for those who are going to be listening to this recording. I will catch you up another time on the beginning. Okay, Alfonso, can I ask where you're joining from? Welcome. Okay, no. So
Hi.
any questions? Anything that you want to add, comment, ask about? Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the sexual prohibition. And for this, maybe I'll share my PowerPoint. I actually have a PowerPoint, but it was more for a beginner's. Hold on, let me share my screen. So now I want to talk a little bit about why this has continued. I've already explained to you that the laws of Tumah and Tahara were very much temple-based. Once the temple is destroyed, why are we still practicing? And I want to talk about a shift from practices that were about men and women to a practice that really becomes a woman's ritual. And here I am in modernity talking to couples that either have little background or come with a lot of baggage around this misogynistic ritual, this ritual that seems very patriarchal, very anti-women. And I start to talk about women's rituals. And that as a feminist, as a Orthodox Jewish feminist, that I'm looking for women's rituals. And we actually don't have a lot in our traditional world. Yes, we like candles, but in all fairness, men like candles also. If it's a home of men, if it's a divorced man or a widowed man, widowered man, or a single man. So it's not fully a woman's ritual, but the mikvah today is really something that is a woman's mitzvah in a very essential way, because it has to do with her body as a woman. And the meaning we're going to talk about when we get to meaning has to do with how women experience the transition through the waters of the mikvah. Now, what I'm showing you here is an ancient mikvah from the Second Temple. There are a lot of these around Jerusalem, largely because men and women would come up or go down to the temple and they would have to jump into the mikvah. They did not spend an hour in the bath cutting their nails and combing their hair. That would not have been the practice. But literally all of these travelers would jump into the mikvah, maybe even with their clothing on. And when they come out, they are now tahor. So that's why there are so many mikvahs. There aren't bathhouses. There are mikvahs that people go in and come out purified. Okay, so this is an ancient mikvah, and there are lots of them, and we also find them in people's homes, private mikvahs. What I want to look at are some modern mikvahs, right? Because we have modernized the mikvah, and what we have are different materials, right? The water, I'm showing a few examples. I took this off the internet, Rabbi Berger. I hope this is the mikvah in Abu Dhabi, because that was the picture that came up. And I thought it was very beautiful using what seems to be Middle Eastern stone. You can comment. Is this correct? This is what I tried to find.
Please forgive me. The pronunciation of my surname is Berger. It's a soft
Oh,
G.
Berger. Thank you
That's
for
okay.
correcting me.
But Rabbi Jeff is more than sufficient. And yes, that is a picture of the women's mikvah in our community. It's a very narrow view of it, and obviously it doesn't have any water. I can probably send you one that's filled. It's a lovely mikvah, and Bezrat
I would
Hashem.
appreciate that, and I will add that to my PowerPoint. Thank you, Rabbi Jeff.
Okay.
So I'm just showing you, I'm just going to bring a few examples. This is, I think this was in France. This is, I don't even know where this is, but it was so beautiful. I took it anyway. And what I'm trying to show you is we went from really what looks to us today very primitive, but very prevalent. We find them all over, made out of stone, to the more modern materials that we've come accustomed to. And when we really want them to look beautiful, a lot of effort and a lot of money go into them in order to encourage women to go to the mikvah. And I'm going to get to that hopefully soon in the second part of the talk. How do we encourage women to continue immersing in the mikvah? how do we attract women? How do we make it a women's space? And I've shown you some examples. The mikvahs, trying to beautify the mikvahs, make the mikvah a special experience, a women's experience, an empowering experience, so women look forward to it. So what I'm going to skip to is, because I want to get through some of the halachic pieces, is that, women become tameh from their periods, from birth, any sort of uterine bleeding. But now we find out that a woman becomes sexually prohibited when she is in any of those states. So I'm going to say that again for those, I know English is not your first language, that women become tameh, they become impure when they experience uterine bleeding. And all of those states of uterine bleeding also make them sexually prohibited. And here's my verse. You shall not approach a woman to uncover her nakedness as long as she is nida, impure, by nida tumata. She is tameh from her nidut, right? She experiences uterine bleeding that makes her nida, and it also makes her sexually prohibited. And this is the part we're going to zero in on, we're going to focus in on, because this is what has the most relevance. And as I started out saying, language matters. And if I keep telling women, oh, you're tameh, some women won't mind, and that's language that doesn't bother them at all. But some women may prefer a more neutral language of you and your partner are sexually prohibited, not because you're tameh and contaminating, but because there's a very important verse in chapter 18, in which God says over and over, I am the Lord God, very much like Sinai. It's a very covenantal chapter. And it's not it's not when the temple is built, not built. It is all the time. These are the chapters in Leviticus and Vayikra that are 24/7, all the time, not related to temple practice. And that's why these take on more heightened meaning. And of course, then we look at the punishment. V'ish asher yishkav et ha'isha dava. A man lies with a woman when she's dava. It's translated as some sort of infirmity or sickness. The feeling being that when a woman had uterine bleeding, the Torah seems to be describing some sort of weakness. Vigilat ervata and mekor ha'ara. He and uncovers her nakedness, her fountain, right, the fountain of her blood. And this part I always point out when I learn with couples, and I often open the text and learn this with them inside. Vihi giltam mekor dameha. And she has uncovered the fountain of her blood. Both of them shall be cut off from among their people. Now, what I do here is I point out something very, very significant, that there is a partnership in the uncovering. This is not about a man uncovers and the woman is a passive partner. This is one of the biblical verses that recognize women as equal sexual partners, right? The man uncovers or the woman uncovers, right? They are both in this relationship together. And only then, when there's intentional uncovering, when she is nida, v'nichratu shnehem, they are cut off from among their people. So we learn that together, and I point out that as ominous as this is, I mean, the Torah is filled with ominous warnings about reward and punishment and action and consequence. This really is no different. Almost the rest of this, not all, but almost all of the sexual prohibitions result in death. This does not result in death. This is a cutting off of the couple from the people who follow the word of God. And then we talk about other mitzvot that are similar, eating on Yom Kippur, eating chametz on Pesach, and that even when cut off, there can be return. This is not some sort of cutting off where you float into some sort of stratosphere without any ability to return. It is a significant prohibition, but it does not come without the ability to return to sanctity. I often prefer not to focus too much on the punishment, but on where the couple is in inviting holiness into their sexual intimacy and the benefit to that holiness. And that as a couple, they are going to make an intentional decision together how to incorporate Kedusha, because that's really the language here. not tahara and tuma, but kedusha, holiness, because we are a people who are holy into their sexual intimacy. And so that's a little bit what I do here when we read the text, when we talk about the text, where does it meet us and how can it be meaningful for us? I very much try to stay away from an approach having to do with fear. I don't think fear and shame are helpful with most of the couples, or I would say any of the couples that I teach. And I prefer instead to encourage something about empowerment, covenantal relationship with God, commandedness, more positive facing words rather than negative. But I also won't sugarcoat what the consequence is, that the Torah takes this seriously. And that is why in our halachic world, our world of observance, one of the first things we do in a community is build a mikvah, because we don't expect people to be sexually celibate. We don't expect married couples to live in celibacy, but we do expect them to bring sanctity into their sexuality. And so the mikvah becomes an important institution in creating that framework of sexual intimacy that has holiness to it. So really already I try through language, through learning text together, acknowledging some of the more uncomfortable pieces of the text, of the tradition, and then saying, okay, now let's talk about what it looks like to practice this today. Okay, comments, questions? Everyone still with me?
I might have missed something, but where did the language could like of Kedusha come from?
Chapter 18 is chapter 18 and 19 and 20 are really within several language where God says Kadoshim tiyu ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokecha is
Okay.
chapter 19. The first prohibition of nida is 18 and the punishment is 20. But really they see that
Okay.
it's the second half of Vayikra when we're no longer really in the kahuna section about korbanot. We're not really from chapter 16 on. Sorry, 17 on. We're moving towards something that is beyond the mikdash. And in chapter 19, it's actually called kedusha, kedoshim tihiyu. So I use that to say kedusha is something God expects all of the time. God says in chapter 19, you will go in my ways and you will follow my instructions because you are kadosh, because I expect you to be kadosh. And the whole framework of sexual prohibition is before and after that chapter. And commentaries see them as kind of wedded together, that there is something there that connects all of those chapters around God's calling for kedusha. I will say, because just because you asked, Rashi even claims that the sum total of kedusha is chapter 18, sexual prohibitions. I think that's too narrow. I think kedusha is much broader than just sexual prohibition, but it's so significant that that Rashi brings that commentary there in the first verse of chapter 19. Okay, so thank you for asking. And I do think there's something lovely, again, when we think about language, the idea of holiness or sanctity is language that often people are drawn to, that, especially the word sanctity, like creating some sort of sacred space. And then I'm going to create that. What does that look like?
Yeah, that's very
Okay.
nice. I was thinking of like the term Taharat Mishpacha, which like I never questioned. I just thought it was like nicer than calling it like rules of Nida. But then when
Yes.
I like thought about the term Taharat Mishpacha, I'm like, wait, where does this come from? And is this term even so meaningful? And I'm not sure how I feel about it.
So I write that in my book, actually. I wrote a book called Uncovered, which has several chapters on this. If you're in America, it's easy to order on Amazon. It's called Women's Roles, Mitzvot, and Sexuality, Uncovered, sort of in Jewish law. And Taharat Mishpacha is a phrase, again, if we talk about language, that's made up. And it's made up in the late 19th century. And it's made up because indoor plumbing begins to be more common, right? You begin to move towards, people begin to be able to have plumbing in their homes, and mikvahs are seen as dirtier, more primitive places. And just talking about nidar, menstruation, is seen as uncomfortable. And family purity reframes the whole thing. It makes it look more attractive. It really becomes a term that is more comfortable for the rabbi to talk about in synagogue at giving his drasha. It's more comfortable for taras mishpacha, right? We all know what we're talking about, but the language itself is very clean language. Tahara, purity, and family. It's not about sexuality. It's not about menstruation. It's not about going to the mikvah. And it really emerges as a term that is going to hopefully empower women. Remember that word empowerment. They're thinking about it then also. And if I open up the language of that has been used until now around discharges and menstruation and nida and sexuality, people are uncomfortable. And I'll say that certainly we have books from the late 19th, 20th century where women describe how dirty the mikvahs are. And if you can take a shower bath, they don't really have showers at first, but baths in your home or in the shared bathroom, if that's what you have, you're not necessarily going to be running to the mikvah. And I think for thousands of years, the mikvah for many women was a real opportunity to cleanse yourself. And once there's indoor plumbing, the mikvah is not as easy a sell in less tradition, as people become less traditional. And so thank you for bringing that up, because it's an important point that taras mishpacha, taharat mishpacha, is trying to do what I'm trying to do. It's trying to find language that will be attractive and inspiring and not alienating. And the feeling is we haven't found it. Oh, taharat mishpacha, and it lasts for a long time. And I think today there's a bit of a shift away from it, because many women will find that alienating. It's not about purity. I'm not unclean. I'm not impure. And it's not about family. It's about me and my husband, me and my partner. It's about intimacy. And I don't want to call it family purity. So now we need to find new language or offer something broader. So I think that's actually an excellent example of how language needs to evolve, or the way we explain things needs to evolve. So what happens, anyone else? Thank you. Very good question. I appreciate that. So first of all, I'm going to say that I want to give one more historical piece as we go through this overview. Until the temple is destroyed, the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed in 70 CE, women have to keep track birth, miscarriage, periods, non-uterine bleeding. All of those things require different steps to get to the mikvah and be tahur and sexually permitted, right? When you become tahur, pure, you become permitted. When you're tameh, you're prohibited. And each of them have different days, amounts of counting till they get to the mikvah. When the Beit HaMikdash is destroyed, over a period of almost 300 years, and I'm not going to bring you all the textual analysis, it's in my book, I can send you the chapter, parts of the chapter. What happens throughout the Talmud, a sense of bringing together different halachic structures to make things clearer. So we have Nida, and we have Zava, and we have Yoledet, the birthing woman. And at some point by 300 CE, Rabbi Zera says, you know what? Let's just bring them all together, and the women will wait 7 clean days. For every drop of blood that is significant, she'll wait 7 clean days, right? Clean of blood days. That's what we end up with. And I often talk about the fact that it didn't just happen in 300 CE. Maybe the Benot Yisrael were involved. Maybe they just agreed to whatever decisions were being made. We don't really know. But what we know is for about 100 years, there's already a process of bringing everything together. So it's easier for women. I do think I have one source that is important. Hold on one second. I'm just going to bring it. I think it's hold on, one that I really like that I want to share with you. Here we go. Yes, because I think this says it all. We have this whole theory, the Benot Yisrael, did they not want to be with their husbands? Did they want to be with their husbands? Were they very pious? So I just want to share this source. It's the Tur. So we're in the son of the Rosh. So we're probably around the 1400s. When the exiles increased and the troubles grew more insistent, and hearts were diminished. They grew concerned they might err in a matter of karet. They don't want to violate a prohibition. So they were additionally stringent with regard to any sighting of red blood. And so that they would not make a mistake between days of Nida and days of Ziva. So they added stringency upon stringency. The Torah says it's all stringency, but it's in order to be clear about what they're doing. That even should a woman experience a single sighting of one drop small as a seed. Hold on, I really wanted the Meiri. Let me see if I have him here. No, not this one. No, I don't have the Meiri here. There's an even better source, which I thought was on my PowerPoint, but it's not. And basically the Meiri says that women would be confused. You're keeping 6 days, I'm keeping 7 days, you're keeping 7. Like, it's just easier if women are all more or less doing the same type of counting, and we stay away from karet. And this became the halacha. And I want to write 2,000 years almost. This is what women have been doing. This is what people have been practicing. Uterine bleeding plus 7 clean days. And it's not a small amount of days, right? One of the things I also do when I teach couples, if they're not religious, I teach them a little differently than if they are. Well, actually quite differently than if they are. But you know, I acknowledge, let's not get into the idea, oh, it's no big deal. It's not, it's only 12 days. 12 days is an enormous amount of time for couples who are yearning for one another and are living together and are sharing space together. For some couples, it works better than others. Absolutely. Some couples appreciate the distance, but for many couples, 5 days, 7 days, 8 days, but 12 days is not an insignificant amount of time. And after childbirth, it's even longer. And so I never minimize the challenge or the sacrifice that these laws require in terms of incorporating them into intimacy. The other thing I do not do is promise that this will be beneficial to their sexual intimacy. I do not say this is going to save, this is what has saved the Jewish marriages. Because unfortunately, even in the time of the Gemara and the time of the Middle Ages, we know that not all marriages were happy marriages, not all marriages were peaceful marriages, not all couples treated one another happily well. And so this is not the magic pill that saves unhappy marriages. Okay? And I often say that, and it's a way of saying, you know, good marriages are good marriages because two people in the relationship work very hard to make them good marriages. And now we can begin to talk a little bit about sexual intimacy and where this can meet a couple and how they might create a positive framework for their intimacy within the background of Nida. So that's more or less where I'm going, and I hope that is of interest. And this I find works, the approach I'm about to share with you, works for couples who are less observant, more observant, and sometimes couples that are mixed. One is observant, one is not observant, and we're going to talk again about language. One more thing I want to say is that until the 20th century, 19th century, I really don't have women's voices, meaning all of the sources that I spent several years studying at Nishmat were men's voices talking about women's bodies and about women's practices. And that's a little jarring. In other words, I don't think there was anyone in my course who didn't at some point feel a little bit as I said, the word is jarring, that there are all these sources written by men and many good men, right? Righteous men, scholarly men, but men talking about women's bodies. And you started to feel the absence of women's voices. Where are the women? What are they saying? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? We, of course, begin to hear women's voices in some of the tchinot, in some of the prayers that have been passed down, and most especially by the 19th and the 20th century, the 20th and the 21st centuries, where women begin to talk. And when women begin to talk, there are a lot of different voices. Some of them wax eloquent and they love mikvah and it's romantic and it's beautiful and it's very, very empowering. And other women begin to talk and they say, no, we don't like the mikveh. It feels coercive. It feels alienating. It feels uncomfortable. And so I want to hold all the women's voices. I want to allow women to honestly talk about what the experience is for them and then perhaps help them, if they are committed to keeping these laws, find ways to make this as positive an experience as possible. And in my approach, the men are a very big part of that as well. The partnership between husband and wife is very significant in our examining where this is going to meet the couple. Okay, anyone have a question before I talk a little bit more? Okay, so I'm going to continue. One of the things I know Naomi likes that I talk about is something that already several years I started doing. And I've already told you that I don't really like to use language of sin and punishment. I don't find when it comes to sexuality that it's helpful to bring in language of prohibition, of shame and guilt. I want couples to be intentional and consensual. And as I said, we'll talk about the biblical text and then we'll move to different language. And instead of the language of asur and mutar, permitted and prohibited, I started using the language of sexual and non-sexual space. And I say, look, we're going to talk about sexual and non-sexual space as determined by the times in which the woman is permitted and prohibited. So we're not pretending that's not what's happening here. And now we're going to use this language. And when we use this language, I often invite the couple to begin to think about what the expectations or differences are between the two of them. Now, remember, I often teach couples who have some sexual experience. Maybe they haven't had sex, but they have some experience. As I said, if it's a religious and a not religious couple, then that's going to be pronounced. But even some of my religious couples have some experience. And I start talking, but I'm also going to say, when I teach a Shomer Negia couple, a couple that has not touched before marriage, then they too often already have an awareness. I don't teach Haredi. I will say I teach, more likely I'm going to teach secular couples or modern Orthodox couples. I think I once taught a Haredi light couple, right? But never fully Haredi. So they've been dating for a while. And there's already an awareness of who is more likely to need touch, who is more likely to experience difficulty with non-sexual space, and which of them are going to be more likely to experience difficulty or some challenge with sexual space. They can't fully know, of course, until they're married. And sometimes in follow-up classes, other things come out. But my point is that I'll just share a story. I once taught a couple, they were living together already. And I started to talk about expectations in non-sexual space and expectations in sexual space. Notice I'm using very modern language that's used in couple counseling. I'm using it in order to explore where the laws of Nida are going to meet couples, where this separation is going to be resonant with them. And I start talking, and more than once, I've had couples say to me, you know, it's actually really interesting because after we talked, we began to actually articulate that we have different needs, different sexual needs, different touch needs, and we had never really talked about it. We kind of, you know, you're in this relationship and you do what you do and you don't do what you don't do. But this idea that I was suggesting that all couples have non-sexual spaces in their relationship and sexual spaces, and that there's often different need that each person brings into the relationship around sexual intimacy. Suddenly we're in a different conversation. We're not talking about the dry halacha. We're talking about relationship and two people in a relationship and their needs and expectations and differences in a relationship. And that I almost always share a story that already probably close to 20 years ago, but it's really an important story, that I was giving a lecture once And a young woman approached me and she said, I want, something about Nida and Mikvah. And reflexively, I almost always go into well, it's not automatically this, it's not this. And then I said to her, I'm not listening to you. What are you trying to say? And she said to me, she and her husband are married, and that one of them, it actually was her, has great sexual need, another one has much less. And they fight all the time, every day. It's a fight every day because one of them has a need that's not being met. And so it becomes tense. And she said to me, I heard about this through Aish HaTorah. She actually had been to like an Aish class. She wasn't observant at all. And she thought it was very compelling and she wanted to ask me more about it. And so we talked, and she said, I like the idea of mandated non-sexual space. The idea that for these days, we're not going to fight because there's no expectation. And then maybe when we get to sexual space, we can align a little more closely. I like it because, first of all, it flips the stereotype that men are more sexual than women, when I have in fact taught quite a few couples where the woman is more sexual than the man, right? And we need to acknowledge that and embrace that. And second of all, what was interesting there was she wasn't really interested in the halacha, because when I said to her, do you want me to help you find a mikvah? She's like, oh no, I don't want to go to the mikvah. I just want to incorporate these days. Like, I like that idea. And I'm like, wow, that is so interesting, because what she understood was she needed an objective framework that was going to impose upon them non-sexual space that was not about one saying no consistently, right? Like, this is objective. I actually checked in with her like a year or two later just to see how she was. They were on some honeymoon, they were doing well. But I often say to couples, try to soften the loud noise around, oh, halacha, 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 or misogyny, or whatever word is bubbling up, and try to think about your relationship. And try to think about what we're talking about here. Different sexual needs, different needs for intimacy, and having clearer boundaries between spaces. What does that begin to feel like? And I often pause and then I tell the following story. And the following story is as follows, not really a story. From my many years of teaching, I find that, of course, there are many different kinds of couples, and every couple is their own narrative and their own world, and couples often go through different stages in their marriage. And that occasionally I meet a couple where they have very strong non-sexual language, where both of them have really wonderful love language, right? Languages that are not about touch and not about sexuality. And for them, Nida works very well, right? Non-sexual space is not so hard because they can love each other in other ways. Sexual space then becomes an opportunity to try out a language that's a little less strong for both of them. I do not meet many couples like this, but I do meet some, and that's very interesting. And I sometimes wonder if they write some of the books. The other extreme are couples who both of them need touch like oxygen. They need it, they crave it. Without it, they feel very alone, and they can't really find other languages that are as strong. I will say those couples often never really make Nida work. And for them, they will look for solutions like hormonal birth control so that they don't get their period very often. Or I'll quote Rabbi Knoll, who before Alav Shalom, who said to me, yeah, my wife and I had 12 children. We didn't really experience this so often. And he smiled so sweetly. And yes, if you want 12 children, then you are not going to be dealing with the challenges of often having non-sexual space. You might be having it because you have 12 children, but not because you are prohibited from touch. So that's another model for couples who are struggling with Nida. Most of the couples I meet, and my guess is most of the couples in the world, are in the middle, where there's disparity or there is not complete alignment between sexual and emotional touch needs. And suddenly Nida becomes an opportunity for us to think about how maybe we can use this in our relationship to strengthen both of those spaces, so both of us feel closer to one another in at different times. And so that's just a small example. Obviously, it's much more complex. Every couple is its own own world. And even with all of that, some couples struggle less. Some people find it empowering, some people don't. I encourage particularly women, instead of feeling this is being imposed on them and feeling very trapped by these laws, to recognize they're choosing to keep these laws for any of the reasons they believe, belief, a sense of commandedness, a sense of responsibility towards one's partner, even if one doesn't really want to keep it, but that there's a choice, that we're making choices to incorporate this. And from a place of choice, let's begin looking for meaning. How can we find meaning in something we're choosing to do that at times may challenge us? And often, right, from there, we're in a different place altogether. We're not talking about prohibited, permitted. We're not talking about sin. We're not talking about bedikot. Again, all of those things need to be talked about, and different people will handle that in different ways. But I often meet with the couple together in order to talk about this. And I'll just quote, I once had a very secular man who was marrying a woman who had been religious. She was still more traditional than him. And he walked in and he's like, I come from a secular family and in Tel Aviv, and I have to tell you, I think these laws are so primitive. That's how we started. And my mother and my grandmother, they don't keep these laws because they're so primitive. There's nothing wrong with women's bodies. There's no reason they should have to go through this process. So that's where we're starting. Okay, and I listen, of course, and I teach the way I teach. And at the very end, he walked out and he turned to me and he said, I thought this was going to be about what we weren't allowed to do. And instead, you taught us about what we can do, about what we can choose, like what we can do. And I saw it had changed everything for him. He said, I thought it was going to be about negativity and prohibition and sin and all those things. And instead, it was something very entirely. I often say when I teach the Kala course, find your own language for those who want to go teach Kalot. You do not need to use my approach or my language. You will all develop your own set of tools for teaching, your own. Listen to a lot of people. Pick and choose what you feel is meaningful for you. That is often most authentic. But recognize, and this is something that at times is very humbling, that the people in front of you may not respond. And that's okay, right? We can't always hit a home run with everyone. All we can do is create a framework of acceptance, of tolerance, of love, of respect for the people who come to us. And we have to be careful not to impose something. We can suggest, we can offer, we can educate, but we can't really impose on people what is meaningful to us if it's not meaningful to them. I try, and I will say, with all of my with all my approach and all my openness and all everything, there are still times I feel I missed the mark with a couple, and I feel very bad about that. You want to try as much as possible to make sure it's a positive experience. I think I, for the most part, do that, but constantly asking yourself, what is my goal with this? Now that I've met this bride, this couple, what is my goal here? What am I trying to achieve? And not resting on what I've done in the past, because you will be surprised that at times something will come along, and as experienced as you are, as you will be, will challenge, right? Well, and so always being prepared to pivot to something else, having your toolbox, a pivot that's like, oh, this isn't working. You know what? Let's try something else. Maybe I heard this teacher, maybe it's it's Nahama, maybe it's Naomi Marmon, maybe it's Jody Waxpress. Those are all people who teach for Eden. And I'm going to take something. I'm like, oh, let's try this. So it's always good to try to be flexible, because people are not all the same. And so I'm going to close. I see it's almost 8 o'clock. And as I said, maybe a few minutes for questions. The last thing I try to do, and this I try to do with the women, is talk about finding meaning. And I often talk about the waters of creation, the waters of life, the idea that water holds within it the metaphor for a lot of female symbolism, transition and renewal and rebirth. The idea that we can call it's called Mayim Chayim, the water of the living in the Torah, and some mikvahs are called Mayim Chayim. the idea that God breathes nishmat chayim, right? So we have the mayim chayim, and we are created from nishmat chayim, the breath of God into us, also has that word chayim. So I offer different ideas that a woman might begin to respond to. As I said, I very much encourage her, if you're going to be keeping this, even if you're just going as a bride, think about a way for it. What are you, how are you walking into the space? What are you bringing into the space? What do you want to receive from the space? I encourage women to think of it as a prayer space, that it's a space in which they can offer up prayers for friends, for family who are struggling to find a spouse, struggling with infertility, for themselves, for their own intimacy, for their own fertility, that it's a place where they can allow the water to just surround them and envelope them, and that it's truly a space where women make a bracha, and then they can have kavanah, they can have kavanot with each immersion that they do, that they can ask the mikveh attendant, you know what, please watch me do 1 or 2 tefillot, immersions, and then if you don't mind, I'd like a minute alone in the water with my own self and my own thoughts and my own kavanot. And again, the idea is for them to begin taking ownership over this practice. I share with them, and maybe I'll end here, that women who are struggling with sexuality, right? Again, we sometimes get women who are struggling to have positive intimacy. They might need a physical therapist, they might need a doctor, they might, all sorts of reasons. Women might have painful sexual relations, and she comes to the mikvah, and it reminds her that we're about to start again, trying all sorts of different suggestions, techniques, and so on. A woman who's trying to get pregnant or after a pregnancy loss, right? The mikvah could be a reminder of what there isn't. And I once heard a beautiful, beautiful lecture in London by a Reform rabbi, a female Reform rabbi, really one of the most moving things I ever heard. She said it took her 8 years to get pregnant. And she went to the mikvah, she used the mikvah, and she said the mikvah was a pool of tears. It felt like it was just crying with her. She felt just so held and comforted by this pool of water, right? That really just held her in her pain and in her sadness. She felt it was with her, it was crying with her every month, both with what was lost and with the hope for some sort of new growth. And I really loved that, because I know other women who go and all they see is the sadness and the loss. Of course, I don't take that from them, but can we try to find a way to enter this space and have it be something that's meaningful in some way for us as women. Thank you very much. Really, I think an hour of listening to me is more than enough. As I said, I'm happy to take a few questions, and then we will. And if you want to be in touch, I'll put my email, and let me know. Anyone want to ask anything?
If I could, I've been discussing this year in particular, it's been a focal point in some of the circles I run in, women with PCOS, women with endometriosis, very painful period to then take hormonal birth control, not to necessarily not be in NIDA, but because their periods are so painful, they can't function. And then they're sort of missing, before they were married, they were told so much about this NIDA thing and how, it's going to be so incorporated into their lives. And then they're sort of missing that. And when you talk to women who aren't getting their period for some reason about where these laws can really meet them when they're not really engaging with them.
Yeah, that's a really excellent question. Thank you. What I would offer to women like that is that if you are not menstruating, you don't become nida, and you don't halachically need the mikvah. It's true. I can't take that. We can't pretend to be something that we're not, right? It's just not. However, once they're married, no one is going to prevent them from using the mikvah, right? It's kind of like you get a green light. No one asks why you're there or for whatever reason. And I might encourage them to think of moments, whether it's once a month or on a special occasion, to use the mikvah for a spiritual immersion, right? The idea, they wouldn't make a bracha, but they certainly could go through they might, again, the mikveh attendant doesn't need to know, and a woman can make a bracha without the mikveh attendant hearing her. I'm a mikveh attendant. I know some women say it quietly. They don't want my amen. They don't want my amen. So hold on, someone's asking me. So I might encourage a woman who really finds that she's missing the experience to say, okay, you can have that. You can have the experience, but I also wouldn't fake the experience. Meaning, it's not going to be the same. It's not going to be the same. But if she wants to use the water in some sort of intentional way, I think that could be very beautiful. That could be very beautiful. But I wouldn't have her pretend to be Nida and not touch her husband and not upset me. I think what I would work with them on is, so if you feel you need some non-sexual space and you want to create it, you want to say, you know what? We need a break in order to recharge. We need we need something in order to recharge, regenerate, and then we want to use the mikvah to return. And I don't see how that would be problematic. You know, it could be she'll do it once and be like, you know what, that was just too weird. I don't want to do that again. But sometimes just offering something. Well, let's think about what non-sexual space could look like. Do you want to use the mikvah to mark the end? Do you want it to be 3 days or 5 days? Not because I want her to, you're going to the mikvah not to permit yourself, but because you want to have, he can go to the mikvah in the morning and you can go to the mikvah at night and you could each have a spiritual immersion. I might encourage, I'm just throwing out ideas. In the same way men go to the mikveh in the morning to prepare for tefillah, they could also go in the morning with the awareness that at night they're going to be with their wives, and perhaps she could use the mikveh in the same way. It's a little unconventional, but I don't see why it would be problematic in any way. She could decide to go up to Har HaBayit, by the way, if she really wants to have more of an experience, because there you would need to have 3 days without sexual relations. You would then actually have to prepare with a bracha if she's in Israel, and she could go up to Har HaBayit, and that could give her some sense, perhaps, of the experience together with a real mitzvah of tahara. So, those are different things I would think of. I would talk to her, see what we could say, but I would remind her that ultimately, this is where she's at right now. And just like someone who's pregnant and nursing and can go sometimes for 2 or 3 years without being nida, even if she misses it, she's not nida. Same thing for women who become menopausal. So some of them will look back, some of them are relieved, and some of them will look back with fondness. And then I'll say, okay, so go to the mikvah one last time. Let's create some sort of final mikvah immersion where you say goodbye to the mikvah. But it's not a halachic immersion, but the water can certainly serve to transition you to whatever you want to be transitioned to. So those are kind of ideas off the top of my head, and I would work individually. This isn't like a blind. These are, I would work with her and see what she and her husband are comfortable with. Okay, anyone else?
I have a question. Like I like the idea of reframing it as sexual and non-sexual space, but I'm also like, not as a teacher as much as personally, like struggle with it because I think like integrating them is so important. Like I think in a marriage, like we're always in a sexual relationship and we're always in a loving relationship, like ideally. And
Yes.
like separating like the emotional intimacy from the sexual intimacy feels to me like a little bit unhealthy and not ideal. So how would you?
So first of all, I often say we are in a sexual relationship and you're trying to desexualize a sexual relationship because that's what the halacha demands, right? So if we're going deeper, I acknowledge that. The reason I call it non-sexual space is because for those days, there can be no expectation. Now, let me take the couple I know. I know a couple who for 7 years, she didn't get her period. She was on an IUD and she was delighted. Best thing that ever happened. They hated Nita. It was best thing ever. It doesn't mean, like you said, they're in a sexual relationship, but there's still going to be that tension of one nights yes, one nights. That's the sexual space, right? The sexual space is going to have with it this need for both of us to work together on what works for both of us. And sometimes one of us is going to be more unhappy than the other, and we're going to have to talk about it. The reason I call it non-sexual space is there's no possibility of sexuality. And so then I want to be intimate. I talk about that. I want to have emotional intimacy. How are you going to create emotional intimacy without the touch or sexual framework? And that is where I have couples begin exploring that. If they're not going to touch at all, some couples get very anxious. Like, are we not going to touch? Other couples will say it's an opportunity. Right? There are different couples who are going to have emotional touch are much less anxious. Oh, so we want to have sex, but we're going to hug, right? Like, so Every couple is its own, responds its own way. But by calling it that, it's just clarifying. We're clarifying instead of saying it's prohibited, right? What can we say? Well, we're usher. But I'm not sure that's better. Usher says the same thing. There's no expectation of sex. It's just using the language of mutar asur. Just because I'm mutar, I'm permitted, doesn't mean I want to be available every night, either the man or the woman. So then I have to navigate that. That's where I gave you a very small insight, but when I talk to couples, I open it up a little more. And just because it's sexual space doesn't mean we're having sex every night. And just because it's non-sexual space doesn't mean I don't want emotional intimacy. Of course I do. It just means I have to use different tools for that intimacy. And like you said, couples are doing that largely every time, all the time, but this gives me more definition, which some couples need, right? That secular woman who came to me after the lecture, what was she struggling with? There were no boundaries between sexual and non-sexual, and she wanted sexual all the time. And that wasn't good for her husband. So they needed, she was grateful that there's this framework that's not about me being in the mood and you not. It's about, oh, for 12 days, we're not arguing or talking about this. And now I know we have to use other tools in our intimacy. As I said, there are other couples who will say, I am so happy I don't have to deal with it. It's better for our marriage. We'll navigate the sexual, non-sexual just fine. We don't need clearly defined space. I was just offering how couples might be able to interact with this, given that behind it is a halachic framework of prohibition. And ultimately that's what's there. So that's what I suggested. But I do say those two things, that it is a sexual relationship. It's not an on-off switch. And number two, that that there's a need for social emotional intimacy in all spaces, but particularly in the non-sexual space.
Now, Hama, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
I think I heard you say that when there's a very high need for physical touch at all times, that it's almost a lost cause to get them to keep the halachos.
I didn't say, I said it was like removing oxygen from the air for them.
And did you say that most people end up keeping or not keeping?
No,
Or
I said even the ones who keep, right? No, I didn't say they don't keep. I said they tend to be the ones who are truly challenged. They don't look back and say this was really good for our relationship. Those are the ones who most urgently will look for the pill, who will say, again, this is very informal. I haven't done thousands of people, but the solution for those couples comes from not being nida, not from finding a way to make nida work.
not from a
That's what I was saying. It doesn't mean they don't keep it. It means they try to remove it so they don't have to keep it, right?
But
That's very different.
not from a psychologist, and it's not necessarily a sign of something else. When there's all of this, there's this huge physical desire that that's almost uncontrollable.
It's not about sexual desire. It's about, a lot of times it's about, it's not just sex. It's the touch. That the 12 days of harchakot, the idea of not touching. My perception today is if we would relax on the harchakot and the allowance of emotional touch, we would gain so much. My frustration today is we've so sexualized touch that the need for emotional touch, which we all need all the time, right? There's something a little bit cruel about removing it. Our lives are difficult in a different way than they were 100 and 200 years ago. Then it was physically difficult. But today there is so much emotional stress and anxiety, and touch just calms us down. And I think the couples who seek to remove it, it's more about the emotional touch. That's why I'm sorry, I said their need for touch is like oxygen, that for both of them, their strongest, and then Rob, oh no, you can develop other love languages. And they're like, it's not that we can't do other things. It's that we feel really lonely when we can't lie next to each other and hold hands and put our arms around each other. That's what most of them are craving, not the sex. The sex, after a certain amount of time, that the dopamine receptors calm down, and most couples find a balance. I'm sorry thank you for asking, because these questions then clarify what I was saying. I really think we need to relax on the emotional intimacy, on the emotional touch. I'm sorry. We're seeing it a little in Israel around the war, right? Where there have begun to be heterim for a woman who is nida to either hug her husband when he comes out of Gaza or when he leaves for Gaza. But I can't tell you how much explosion there is around that. And I that concerns me a little bit, that we're so afraid that these very frum couples are somehow going to go from a need for that closeness to suddenly like everything's going to come off. I wish we wouldn't be so afraid of that, but I know why. As I developed this in my book and I critique it in my book. I think we're losing a lot by not being more forthcoming about emotional touch. I really do. But I'm wondering what you think, that if you're the psychologist, what you think.
I'm not the psychologist. I just
Oh, I thought you
somehow
said you were a psychologist.
there along some of my journeys to learn to teach. We were,
Mhm.
somebody was talking about abuse and trauma,
Mm,
and that this need, this extraordinary need for touch, it was a red flag for trauma of some kind. I don't know
yeah,
what that
no,
means.
I don't think.
Okay.
I don't think that's true. It could be they're talking about something very specific, but more and more studies show, and I, you know, that just like even putting your hand on the shoulder, just like the amount of what it does to the cortisol levels in the brain is, you know, you come home from a day where you had a very hard day and you can't have a hug from your husband. There's no way for anything to compensate for that. There just isn't. Once you have kids, it's a little easier. You hug the kids, but it's still not the same. It's not the same as from your partner who can appreciate what you're going through. So I'm just, you know, that I think is the bigger challenge.
And we
I don't want
normalize like going
what?
to we like normalize going 2 weeks without touching our partners.
Exactly.
And I think like I don't want that to be normal. Like even if I keep halach, it should always be difficult. I shouldn't like get used to that. And
Yeah, I'm very against normalizing that. I think it's actually, and I write this in my book. I think it's actually abnormal to not touch the person who is nearest and dearest to you when you are when you have emotional need, not just emotional. I don't want, yeah, you know, women are so emotional. Men also need emotional touch.
200 years ago, it was different. People didn't need it. The rabbis
I
didn't
think
tell
so. I think so. I think so.
that it was
I
different.
think, yeah. I do think so. I think Malka Pietrokowski writes a lot about this, but I think, look, the rise in mental health issues, mental health crisis, it's also unprecedented. And along with it comes all of this agitation that never would have really existed. The levels of anxiety, as I said, depression, OCD, those are all things that we didn't, that we never really dealt with. And I will say, Rabbi Yoni Rosenzweig has written a very important book on mental health and halacha, and he has a chapter on touch being an important piece in mental health disorders, and some rabbanim who are finally beginning to be more lenient with that kind of touch. But then, of course, people have to feel: am I anxious enough? Am I depressed enough? Am I sad enough? Am I like? That's why that's abnormal. That's abnormal. Right? Do I have to feel guilty because I'm crying? But like
But-
that's where I think I think we might be. We'll see. My hope is that next generation is gonna be a little more moderate. I'm seeing signs, but you know, it takes time. This was,
Could also,
I think when you,
next
yeah,
generation's angst will go down, right?
me, yeah, I hope
But
so.
don't the halachot of not touching like not just come from the fact that we want to prevent like having sex, but because there's like the Rambam says sexual
Read-
touch is not allowed. Read
I
the
don't,
book.
so
Okay.
there's also the Ramban. Read my chapter and then write to me. There's
Okay.
someone in your community who has the book. I really
Okay.
outline this very
Okay,
beautifully.
I'll do that.
And you can, you know,
I'll do
but
that.
I explain why I think it became so heightened, and that I think it's a call to really, we need to step back a little bit. It's gotten to a point where a woman is going through chemotherapy, there are rabbanim who won't allow her husband to hold her hand. I mean, what are we doing? Why is that? How is that Judaism? How is that compassion? How is that chesed? How is that anything? That's why I'm saying I think we've gotten really far, and now we need to begin. Not all touch is sexual touch, right? You're right. The Rambam says sexual touch, but holding a hand or an arm, even if I have a little bit of sexual response to that, which is normal, I don't want to, but it doesn't mean it's really sexual touch. So anyway. Read it and then we can we can talk. I defend that position in my book. Okay, guys, I'm gonna go. It's 8:15 and I have to finish an article. And this was lovely. Thank you, Zohar and Sarita and Rivka and Esther and Sila and Aviva who stayed on, and Rabbi Jeff. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.